I thought she was just my landlady, someone kind enough to rent me a room. But the night her arm brushed against mine in the hallway, and she whispered, "Don't rush off," I realized she wasn't just asking me to stay in the house, she was asking me to stay in her world. When I first moved into her house, I didn't expect it to feel so personal. Most rented places carry an emptiness, a sense that you're just passing through. But this home was different. Every corner felt lived in, filled with quiet details that belonged to her. The faint fragrance of jasmine drifted down the hallway, and her soft slippers sat neatly by the door, as if she had just stepped out of them a moment before. She greeted me that evening with a smile that carried both warmth and restraint. There was confidence in the way she carried herself, but also a gentleness that made me feel welcome. She offered dinner, saying it wasn't much, but the care she put into preparing it told me otherwise. The table was simple: 2 plates, 2 glasses, a steaming bowl of rice, and a chicken curry whose spices seemed to fill the entire kitchen. At first, our conversation was polite. She asked about my family, my studies, where I came from. But as the minutes passed, something softened in her voice. She leaned forward slightly when she listened, her eyes searching my face as if she wanted to know more than just the surface details. What struck me most was the way she noticed things. When I hesitated before reaching for more food, she gently placed another spoonful on my plate, telling me not to hold back. When my glass was half empty, she quietly refilled it without breaking the rhythm of our talk. It wasn't just hospitality. It felt like she was paying attention to me in a way I wasn't used to. After dinner, I insisted on helping with the dishes. She tried to refuse, but I stood beside her at the sink, sleeves rolled up, rinsing plates as she soaked them. The kitchen light cast a soft glow on her face, and in that closeness, I noticed the finer details, the faint lines near her eyes that deepened when she smiled, the calm steadiness of her hands as they moved in the water. It was then that it happened, a small, almost accidental touch. As I passed her a plate, her fingers brushed against my wrist. It was nothing more than a second, a fleeting contact, yet it left a warmth on my skin that lingered long after she pulled away. I glanced at her, wondering if she had felt it too, but she carried on washing, her expression composed. Still, there was the slightest pause in her movements, almost unnoticeable, as if she had. When I finally went upstairs to my room, I should have felt tired from the long day of moving. But instead, I lay awake, replaying every detail of that dinner. The way she served me more than herself, the sound of her laughter when I shared a small story, and most of all, that brief touch that seemed to echo louder in my memory than any words we had spoken. I had come here looking for a place to stay. What I hadn't expected was to feel something stir inside me, as if I had stepped into more than just a house. I had stepped into her world. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though not the kind I expected. At first, I thought living in her home would mean polite distance, exchanging greetings, paying rent on time, and then retreating to my own space. But she seemed to have a quiet way of slipping into my days, as though the house itself carried her presence into every moment. She checked in more often than she needed to. A gentle knock on my door in the evenings, her voice low as she asked, "Did you eat?" Or, "Do you need anything from the market tomorrow?" Sometimes she'd step just inside the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms folded lightly across her chest. She never stayed long, but her eyes always lingered, like she wanted to say something else and stopped herself. I found myself waiting for those little intrusions. There was something comforting about them. The way her words carried care, but also something unspoken, something softer. One evening, after a long day, I found her in the living room watching TV. She glanced over and patted the seat beside her without a word. I hesitated, then sat down. The couch was wide enough, but somehow we ended up closer than necessary. The program on the screen barely held my attention. What I noticed instead was the quiet rise and fall of her breathing, the way her arm rested on the cushion between us, close enough that the fabric of her sleeve brushed against mine when she shifted. It wasn't dramatic, just a light touch of fabric against skin, but it felt deliberate in its stillness. Neither of us moved away. If anything, the silence seemed to grow heavier around us, broken only by the hum of the television. I glanced at her once, quickly, and caught the faintest smile on her lips, like she knew the closeness hadn't gone unnoticed. My chest tightened at that smile. It wasn't bold or playful. It was quiet, restrained, but filled with an awareness we both shared. Later that night, as I made tea in the kitchen, she joined me, barefoot, her hair loose around her shoulders. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching me pour the hot water. "You're settling in well?" she said softly. I nodded, trying to act casual, though the warmth of her presence in that small kitchen felt anything but ordinary. As I handed her a cup, our fingers touched again. This time neither of us pulled back immediately. Her hand was warm, steady, lingering for just a second too long before she wrapped it around the cup and looked down into the steam. When I returned to my room that night, I couldn't shake the thought. Was this closeness simply her kindness, the way she cared for anyone under her roof? Or was there something more in the way she brushed against me, the way her silence carried weight? The line between comfort and something deeper was blurring, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to resist it. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the house itself seemed to breathe. I had been getting ready to head out, shoes in hand, jacket over my arm. She was in the hallway, adjusting a vase of fresh flowers on the small table near the stairs. The scent of lilies filled the air, blending with the faint trace of her perfume. The hallway was narrow, just enough space for two people to pass. As I stepped forward, I realized she hadn't moved aside. She stayed there, half-turned, as if she wanted me to come closer. And I did. Our arms brushed as I slipped by, a gentle friction of fabric against fabric. But she didn't step back. If anything, she leaned ever so slightly, her shoulder grazing mine, her hair brushing against my cheek. The touch was fleeting, but it stole the air from my lungs. I murmured a quick, "Excuse me," trying to keep it light, but before I could take another step, I felt her presence draw in closer. Then, in a voice softer than the whisper of the flowers shifting in their vase, she said, "Don't rush off." The words weren't commanding. They weren't casual either. They were something in between, a request, a hesitation, a quiet pull on my heart that stopped me mid-stride. I turned slightly, caught in the nearness of her. She was standing just inches away, her eyes lifted to mine. In them was something I couldn't name at first, a mixture of warmth, of curiosity, of a loneliness she rarely let show. Her breath was warm against my ear, and the faintest smile touched her lips, but it wasn't playful. It was vulnerable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. I could feel my pulse hammering, every beat echoing in the small space between us. "I was just meeting a friend," I finally said, though my voice sounded uncertain, softer than I meant it to. Her hand moved, almost as if she might reach for me, then stopped halfway. Instead, she rested her fingertips lightly against the edge of the table, steadying herself. "It's late," she said, her tone gentle, her eyes never leaving mine. "You can go tomorrow." The suggestion wasn't about the friend or the time. I knew it. She knew it. It was about this, about not letting the closeness slip away too soon. I nodded slowly, unable to break her gaze. Then, with a breath that felt heavier than it should have, I set my jacket down on the chair. Her shoulders eased, and the smallest sigh escaped her lips, almost imperceptible. She stepped back then, just enough to let me breathe, but her eyes lingered as if to say she had wanted me to understand. That night, I didn't rush off, and from that moment, I knew we had crossed an invisible line, one we couldn't return from. The night the lights went out, the house felt different. A storm had been brewing all afternoon, and when the power finally gave way, the silence that followed was broken only by the steady sound of rain against the windows. I was fumbling for my phone's flashlight when she appeared in the doorway, already holding a candle. Its flame glowed softly against her face, casting shadows that made her eyes seem deeper, more searching. "Come," she said gently. "It's warmer in the kitchen." We sat across from each other at the small wooden table, two candles flickering between us. Their light turned the ordinary kitchen into something more intimate, more secret. She poured tea from a kettle she'd warmed on the gas stove, and the steam curled upward like smoke from a quiet fire. At first, our conversation was casual, about the storm, about how unreliable the power grid had become. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Maybe it was the way the shadows softened her features, or the way the storm wrapped the house in a cocoon of sound. Whatever it was, she seemed less guarded than usual. "I don't often admit this," she began, her voice low, her fingers circling the rim of her cup. But this house, it gets lonely. Too many rooms, too many quiet nights. She gave a small, self-conscious smile, then looked away, as though she hadn't meant to say so much. Her honesty caught me off guard. I had always seen her as composed, self-sufficient. To hear her speak of loneliness, it stirred something in me, a tenderness I didn't quite know how to express. I get that, I said softly. Sometimes, even when you're surrounded by people, it feels like you don't quite belong anywhere. The words slipped out before I could stop them, and for a moment, I regretted revealing that truth. But she leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on mine, and I knew she understood. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy with meaning, like both of us were standing on the edge of saying more. Under the table, our knees brushed. Neither of us moved them away. That small point of contact grew louder in my awareness than the thunder outside. She reached for her candle, adjusting it slightly, and in the movement, her hand rested briefly over mine on the table. It wasn't long, no more than a heartbeat, but the warmth of her touch steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, almost as if she were afraid the words would break if spoken too loudly. My chest tightened. There was nothing dramatic in her confession, no declarations, no demands. Just simple, unguarded truth. And yet, it carried more weight than anything else she had said. As the candles flickered lower and the storm raged on outside, I realized something had shifted between us. We were no longer just landlady and tenant. We were two people who had begun to see, and to need, something in each other that went far deeper than circumstance. It was late when I came down to the kitchen, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I had been reading in my room but couldn't shake the dryness in my throat, so I padded downstairs for a glass of water. The lights were dim, only the small bulb above the counter glowing. And there she was, already standing by the sink, dressed in a loose sweater and soft cotton pants, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look younger, more unguarded. She turned when she heard me, her expression softening into a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked. "Just thirsty," I said, holding up the glass. My voice sounded too casual, too careful, even to my own ears. I stepped beside her to fill the glass, and the closeness of the space seemed to draw us together. Her presence was quiet but undeniable, her warmth filling the kitchen more than the light did. As I set the glass down, she noticed a small crumb on my shirt, something I hadn't realized was there. Without thinking, she reached forward and brushed it away. Her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, resting lightly against my chest. It was such a simple gesture, ordinary even, but in that stillness, it felt like the world slowed. I could feel the soft pressure of her fingertips through the thin fabric, the warmth of her skin radiating into mine. My instinct was to step closer, to close the small distance that remained between us. I could almost imagine it, her head leaning against me, the quiet steadiness of her breath against my chest. But I hesitated, because in that heartbeat, questions filled my mind. Was this affection, or was I imagining something that wasn't there? Was I reading into a kindness that was never meant to mean more? And even if it did mean more, was it right to act on it? She was my landlady, a woman who had offered me shelter and care. What if stepping forward ruined everything? I caught her eyes then, and I knew she was hesitating too. There was something in the way she held my gaze, steady, searching, almost vulnerable, like she was asking herself the same questions. Her hand stilled against me, then slowly slipped away, her fingers trailing lightly as if reluctant to let go. The silence between us was filled only by the faint dripping of the tap and the ticking of the clock on the wall. My chest ached with everything I wanted to say, everything I wanted to do, but couldn't. She gave a soft smile then, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Good night," she whispered, her voice carrying a gentleness that felt like both an invitation and a retreat. And just like that, she turned, walking quietly back toward her room. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, the cool glass of water in my hand, my chest still burning with the warmth of her touch. The moment had been so close, and yet it slipped through our fingers, leaving behind only the echo of what might have been. The day had been heavy, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the long hours of silence in my room. Maybe it was the weight of all the moments we'd left unfinished. By evening, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring at the muted glow of the television without really watching it. I must have looked lost in thought, Because when she walked in, she paused in the doorway. For a moment, she simply watched me, her expression unreadable. Then she crossed the room and stood behind the couch, her hand resting lightly on the backrest. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Her voice carried more concern than the question itself. I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. She didn't seem convinced. Slowly, she moved around the couch and sat beside me. Not at the far end, not with distance between us, but close, close enough that her presence seemed to quiet the air around us. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but words failed. It was she who bridged the silence. Her hand rose, hesitant at first, and rested gently on my shoulder. The touch was simple, but it unraveled me. I hadn't realized how much I had needed that small reassurance. The steadiness of someone's hand grounding me, reminding me I wasn't as alone as I felt. Almost without thinking, I lifted my own hand and placed it over hers. Her skin was warm, her fingers slender beneath my palm. I didn't squeeze, didn't pull. I just held it there, letting the silence stretch between us, filled only with the steady rhythm of our breathing. Then she shifted closer. The couch dipped under her weight as she turned toward me, and before I could fully process it, she leaned in. Her head rested lightly against my chest, her cheek pressing against the fabric of my shirt. The moment froze me. My arms hovered, unsure if I should move, if I should hold her or stay still. But when I felt the faint, steady beat of her heart through that closeness, and when her breath softened against me, the hesitation broke. I wrapped my arms around her, slowly, carefully, as though I was afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she melted into me, her body relaxing, her weight settling in a way that felt trusting, intimate. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. No words, no explanations. Just the quiet truth of her leaning into me and me holding her, both of us knowing this was no longer an accident or a passing moment. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met mine with a softness that said more than words ever could. Something had changed between us. The distance we had held on to so carefully was gone, and in its place was something unspoken, undeniable, and deeply real. The morning after felt different, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything ordinary suddenly carried new weight. I woke to the faint aroma of tea drifting through the house, a sound of soft movement downstairs. For a moment, I lay still, wondering if last night had been real. The way she leaned against me, the quiet surrender of her body in my arms. Had I imagined it? Or was it truly the moment when the walls between us had finally fallen? When I stepped into the kitchen, the answer came wordlessly. She was already there, standing by the stove, hair loosely tied, dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, touching her in gold. She turned when she heard me, and her smile was different now. Not forced, not polite, just knowing. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm in a way that reached straight through me. "Morning," I replied, my throat a little dry. She had already laid the table, 2 plates, toast, eggs, fresh fruit. It struck me how natural it looked, how much it felt like something shared rather than offered. I moved to help, taking the teapot from her hands and setting it down. Our fingers brushed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no quick retreat. She let her hand rest against mine, just for a second, before easing away with the faintest smile. We ate quietly at first, the kind of silence that felt easy, unhurried. But what made it different was where she chose to sit. Not across from me, as she usually did, but beside me, close enough that our elbows touched when we reached for our plates. At one point, she laid her hand gently over mine on the table. She didn't look at me when she did it. She just let it rest there, light but steady, as if to say that words weren't necessary. I looked down at our joined hands, her fingers soft against my skin, and felt a calm spread through me. This wasn't about rushing into something or making declarations. It was about presence, about knowing that, from now on, I wouldn't walk through this house and feel like a guest. I belonged here with her. The sunlight shifted, spilling across the table, catching in her hair. She finally looked at me then, her eyes steady, quiet but sure. "This feels right," she said softly. Not a question, not an explanation, just truth. And I nodded, because there was nothing else to add. Sometimes the most important things aren't spoken in long speeches or promises. Sometimes they're in the way a hand rests on yours at the breakfast table, or in the way silence feels like comfort instead of emptiness. That morning, I realized we hadn't just shared a house. We had chosen, without ever saying the words, to share something far more fragile, far more lasting. And that was enough. Sparkles, if this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow-burn romance stories. And share it with someone who believes that love can be found in the quietest, most unexpected moments. Sparkles.